Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So, this is going to be part two of my story. In the previous video that I did last week, I was talking about how I grew up a little bit and then how God spoke to me, and also how I met my wife and stuff. So, in this story, I would like to continue and talk about how, like I mentioned in the last video, I was talking about how God has blessed us in the nearly 22 years of marriage, and it's so true. God did bless us enormously, and I mentioned in the last video that I was extremely immature, when I first got married. I mean, who isn't? You live and learn, you grow physically, spiritually, and you learn a lot of things. So, like I mentioned, I talked to Daniela the first time, back in 2003, I believe it was July, like I mentioned in the last video, and I was saying that we clicked really, really good. We clicked so well that, it felt like I knew her from somewhere. And of course, I also mentioned that sometime in September of '03, I asked her out, and then we started to make wedding plans and so on and so forth. And I also mentioned that at the men's group that we were at called Monday Club, I was very excited, and I was telling the guys that, God willing, I'm going to get married, and then so on and so forth. Anyways, moving forward, we continued to talk and we made wedding plans, and November 9th of 2003, we got engaged. That was awesome, it was extremely awesome. And I was like super, how do I say this? I was super blessed first and foremost, and then very excited that I was moving forward, even though, you know, as I mentioned, even though I was and am legally blind, I never would have thought that, hey, I'm going to have my own family and this and that. So that's exactly what happened. We moved forward, and, roughly 6, 7 months later, we got married, and life went on. But because of me being kind of immature, I didn't really know. Obviously, who does, But I didn't know a lot of things in life, obviously, being young and, just kind of being new to this, of course. We definitely encountered a lot of problems, it was definitely difficult, very difficult. And for me, being legally blind, it was definitely extremely hard to find a job. It was very hard to find a job. And I remember after my wife and I got married, like maybe I would say maybe after 3 months or so, unfortunately, I got laid off. And it was definitely a tough time, extremely tough time. When I think about these times, I was like, oh my gosh. Back then, I'm going to be honest, both my wife and I, we never would have thought that we're going to get out of this, financial blockage, I guess, if you will, or, being financially unstable. And of course, she went to school, but this is okay. So this all happened, getting laid off and all that stuff when we were still in Washington State, in Vancouver, Washington. We moved in, and, she started school. I lost my job. It was difficult for me to find a job as a vision impaired person. I've had kind of messed up encounters in the sense that I remember one time going to a job interview, and I'm sure you all noticed that my eyes move like really fast, like this, involuntarily. It's because of my nystagmus. But I had a job interview, and I remember being at the job interview, and this lady looks at me, kind of like, looks like this, looks like this. She's like, "What is wrong with you? Are you drunk?" And it's funny when I think about it now, but back then I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so messed up. But a lot of people are ignorant, obviously, if you don't explain to them why these things happen. I've explained to people why my eyes move this way, so on and so forth, and they're very ignorant. Some people, they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But anyway, so, I've had bad encounters like that. But we lived in Washington State. We were, how do I say this? At some point in our lives, we had to go to these places where you get food, canned foods and so on and so forth. We had to get to food stamps for a while, or, we were in really, really bad situation financially. We were struggling financially, and it was definitely not a fun thing to go through. You know what's awesome though? So in 2005, at some point, my parents, beginning of 2005, my parents, they were talking about moving to Georgia. And okay, so, time flew by. They moved to Georgia. But I remember this story will stick with me for the rest of my life because it's the most amazing thing that ever happened. Like, when you follow God's will, and when you're in God's will and you listen to what God tells you to do, it's amazing. He guides you step by step. And that's exactly what happened to us this is in May of 2005. So I remember my wife and I, we were still like, struggling financially, so on and so forth. We've never, obviously, newlyweds, we've never moved, or, we've never, anyways, we were still learning things. As a newlywed, you're still learning things. You're still growing. And I remember we were just laying down for a nap, and I had my eyes closed, and I just feel something hit me right here in the rib. Not really hard, but like, as I was laying down and I had my eyes closed, something hit me in the rib, and I opened my eyes really wide, and I was like, man, this is interesting. And then I hear the voice of God telling me that we're going to move to a state that starts with G and ends with an A. And I'm like, okay, Georgia. Interesting. And then the voice tells me, which is the voice of God, tells me that we're going to move in Gwinnett, Lawrenceville. Up till that time, I'm going to be honest, up till that time, I've never heard of Gwinnett, Lawrenceville. I've never heard of Buford. I've never heard of Carrollton, Georgia. I've never heard of nothing besides Atlanta, Georgia. That's the only thing I knew about, right? And the voice of God tells me that we're going to move in Gwinnett, Lawrenceville. At that time, I didn't know Gwinnett was a county, nor did I research it, nor was I interested to research it, to be honest. But God tells us, we're going to move in Gwinnett, Lawrenceville. And I was like, God, how is that even possible? Because, me with my human mind, I wasn't even thinking. I didn't do the research. I was just kind of like dazed because of the nap. And I was like, how can we move in two cities at once? That's impossible. Well, God told me we're going to move in Gwinnett, Lawrenceville. And it was just so interesting because I was like, okay, that's great. And then I remember getting ready for bed once, this one time, and I was brushing my teeth, and then God says, move in 2 weeks. I was like, what? We weren't even ready. We didn't even have our stuff packed. We didn't know nothing, absolutely nothing about moving, you know? That's when we barely began our marriage, our lives, you know? And so I was like, okay. So I told my wife, and she was kind of like a little, not hesitant. How do I say this? She was kind of like skeptical a little bit. She's like, I don't know about this. And then it was just awesome because in 2 weeks, in a day, we actually moved. And we were with this other gentleman that moved there too. It was really interesting the way God works. We moved, and then I remember we bought a house in Lawrenceville. But I honestly didn't think of anything anymore. I was like, whatever, you know. I was like, I didn't even think of how God spoke to us, how God told us to move to Georgia. You know, life got busy. And, you know, you're like, I was just kind of like, okay, whatever. And I remember one time we got bills in the mail, and my wife's like, hey, remember how God told you that we're going to move to Gwinnett, Lawrenceville? I was like, yeah, why? And she's like, we live in the city of Lawrenceville, Gwinnett County. And I was like, whoa, it's really cool. That's when you know that God speaks so well. And I know I've had other people tell me that, okay, man, I don't know about that, you know? Maybe it was just in your head that you wanted to move and so on and so forth. I'm like, sure thing, think of what you want. But how do you explain that? How do you explain that God would tell me to move to Gwinnett, Lawrenceville when I've never heard of Gwinnett, Lawrenceville in my life? I've only heard of Atlanta, Georgia. That's it. But yeah, that's exactly what happened. So we moved, and time flew by. We were still broke. We were still financially struggling pretty bad. And I remember I hate to admit this, but as a husband, I wasn't doing my best. And there was a period of time when Daniela, my wife, she was like really, really connected to the Lord. And she was, how do I say this? She always wanted to go to prayer nights and this and that. And there was a period of time in my life where I was kind of like in a depressive state again. And I was like, every time she would ask me, hey, sweetie, you want to come to prayer with me? And I was like, nah, I'm good. And she would go, and she was so connected to God. I remember, I believe this was before she went to school. Yeah, or after. I don't remember. But she was working at a hotel, and she was extremely, extremely connected to God, like to the point where I would catch her praying. I remember this one time. I don't remember. I came home from somewhere, and I hear her crying, like wailing, and I was like, oh my gosh, is she okay? Because, at that time we were still struggling financially, and she was probably thinking to myself, like, man, she was probably depressed that we don't have enough money and this and that. But no, I went upstairs in our room. Guess what? She was in the closet crying out to God. And when I heard her pray, I had no choice but to get on my knees and pray with her. And I was like, man, this is awesome. Now, of course, time flew by, and I remember this one time because, so I've had experiences with God, of course. God spoke to me numerous times, but I've never really had a true revelation, like a true relationship with God. The reason why I'm saying this is because hearing things in church growing up, but some people, the way they preach, the way they portray the word of God, I'm sorry that I'm going to have to say this, but it's true. they, sorry, they do not have the calling and the anointing of God. And I don't want to judge anybody, but the reason why I'm saying that's because of the fact that they read a scripture and they go off tangent and they say a bunch of mumbo jumbo, a bunch of things that it doesn't even make sense. And this is summer of 2007, hearing all this, so many things that, sorry, so many like untruths, hearing so many untruths in my life and being confused of certain things in my life. I remember laying in bed one time and I was like, just depressed. I was thinking to myself, "Oh, I had enough. I'm done." And I remember laying in bed and I was telling God, I was like, "God, I'm done with you. I'm done with Christianity. I'm done with everything. I'm done with church. I'm done with absolutely everything. I'm done. I'm just going to go into the world and so be it." And after I said that, man, I feel guilty saying that, no joke. But after I said that, like, I heard the voice of God telling me, what did I do to you in order for me to deserve this kind of thing? What did I do to you for you to think this way? And then when God said that, that's when all those things came back to me, where God first spoke to me. And each and every single time, he was very, very calm, no matter what I was going through. And I was like, "Lord, I'm sorry. I'll never do that again." And I never did. But from that point onward, I began to kind of like understand more and just, I don't know, like think differently. I remember in 2008 up till 2000, from 2000, sometime in end of 2005 to like roughly towards the end of 2008, I mean, those 3 years, I was being selfish in many ways. I hate to say this, but I put my wife through a lot. And to be honest with you, if I were her, and if somebody did that to me, my spouse did that to me, like put me through, how do I say this? Being selfish and putting me through like terrible situations or whatever the case was, I would be like, "Okay, that's it. I'm done. See you later." But she didn't do that. She didn't do that. She had unconditional love, which is awesome. And she still has unconditional love. I know I've done, being selfish and just being immature and not wanting to change many times, not wanting to work. There was a period of time when I was just like, I don't feel like working and this and that. I remember speaking to my dad many times, and he used to tell me, "Man, I would be careful if I were you, because this woman loves you." And oftentimes I used to think, man, that's so true. But anyway, so 2008 rolled around, and I remember me and my wife, we went to theaters to watch Fireproof. That's when it was out. And seeing that movie, I'm not kidding you, seeing that movie, it made a huge transformation in my life. Yeah, was I still selfish? Yes. Was I still doing things that I wasn't supposed to do? Absolutely, unfortunately. But that helped me tremendously to understand more things and to treat her much better with respect. And it's just so awesome. And like I mentioned earlier, she was saying that, you know, okay, not that she was saying, but we were really, really financially broke, unstable. She was working at these low end jobs, making a certain amount of money. And she was like saying that, hey, I'm never gonna make more than X amount of money. She used to kind of think to herself like that. After she finished her college degree, she got a job. And I remember I got a job too, you know, shortly after she got hers. And I remember her calling me and saying that, hey, I had a job interview, uh, this company, and I got the job. And we were both crying, and we were like, wow, praise God, that's awesome. And then from then on, we learned more. We took financial classes and learned a lot. We learned a lot. We learned to save money. We learned to use money. How do I say this? The proper way, I guess, if you will. And then we became debt free twice by God's grace. And I'm going to be honest, back in the day, I used to think to myself, man, we're never going to get out of this rut. We're just going to be here stuck forever. We're going to be poor all our lives. Oftentimes, I used to see people that were my age or a little younger, and I saw my sisters, my sister that's a bit younger than me, and my other sister that's even younger than me. They're both married, had beautiful homes. Not that I didn't, but I used to think to myself, man, I'll never amount to anything. I used to think to myself back then, I'm gonna be honest, but I used to think, man, I'm gonna be stuck here for life. And even having these jobs, I used to want to make big money and this and that, and it just never happened back then. And of course, I've always liked to, to do music, to record music and this and that, and I used to like put all my albums on CDs back then and try to sell them and this and that. People felt sorry for me, and it was just like how do I say this? Is for me at least, it felt like I was like a total mess. It felt like I was never gonna get out of this place. But by God's grace, we did. Like I mentioned earlier, we paid debt twice, which is awesome. And here we are. By God's grace, we're doing well financially. We're doing well spiritually. There's definitely a lot more growth spiritually for everybody, including myself. But nah, it's really awesome. And then she got her job. She started working. I started working, and it was just a blessing from the Lord. And then I remember this one time. So this is when we were still in Georgia, but I remember this other time where we wanted to move to Colorado. Well, I wanted to move to Colorado because I was doing some research. This is like 2010. Sometime in 2010, I was doing some research, and I was thinking to myself, like, man, it'd be nice to move to Colorado because, after I did research, because transportation for somebody who's vision impaired like myself, I could be independent. Because I know here in Georgia, there's the transportation for vision impaired people. I mean, there's no such thing, unfortunately. But then, we did some research. I was working back then, and then obviously some of my family members, including my wife, whenever she was off, took me to work. But then my family members left. One of my sisters lived here, but she lived really far, 45 minutes away from where I was living at the time. And it was just difficult. So unfortunately, I couldn't work anymore because of transportation. But then we moved to Colorado. We were thinking about moving to Colorado. And I remember this one time, I was like, okay, I don't want to make sudden moves without God telling me what to do. I don't want to move just out of my own because just for the sake of moving, right? Well, I remember one of my brothers lived with us at that time, and I was like laying in bed. It was like 3 in the morning. I was waiting for him to get home, and I was kind of restless, and I couldn't sleep, and I was just like laying in bed, and I was just sitting there, and I see this. I hear God's voice saying that, you know, I was a member at this one church, and God was telling me that, I'll no longer be a member here anymore, and I'll be a member at a smaller church. And it's just so interesting because I've never seen this church. I mean, I've seen it in videos, but I didn't pay attention to the way things look, because usually, when people film, when the services were filmed, they only had one camera and they filmed just in the front. Anyways, and I didn't pay attention to, how the church looked like, so on and so forth. Well, in this vision, I was shown the church 360, exactly how it looks like, exactly, or exactly how it looks like. And I was like, wow. And I remember I called my wife at work, and I was telling her that, hey, we're moving to Colorado. And we both started crying. Wow. And she's like, wow, that's awesome. That's really awesome. And we did, And I remember going to our first church service after Daniela and I had moved to Colorado, and I entered the church. I looked around, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly how my vision was. So yeah, we moved there, and of course, through life, you still go through tough times. You go through different experiences. You go through all sorts of stuff, and it's interesting. I went to Colorado, and of course, I fell into some things that weren't according to God's will. And I was like, thinking to myself, I'm like, man, God brought me here for this. But obviously, it's not God's doing, it's my doing. I chose to do that. But honestly, through all this, I've learned to not repeat my mistakes. And I've learned to stay humble and, stay close to the Lord and be faithful to Him. That's what I learned through all this. And I'm just grateful and thankful that, because going through these things helped me grow spiritually, helped me grow a lot. And when I think back, of all the things that I've done, I always say to myself, man, I'm never going to repeat that ever again. Never. And there's many, many things the way, there are many blessings that God has given us. And even with a lot of things in our lives, even how we purchased this home and everything, I love the fact that God's way is always the best way, I remember moving to California in 2013. We moved to California. We lived there for 3 years, and we decided to move back to Colorado because, again, same thing, transportation, so on and so forth. And I remember there was this person that told us that God showed him a vision to where, we moved to Colorado and our house was upside down and things were not working out and yada, 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 right? And I was like, I don't know if I believe that. I remember being in California, and at that time, this was March of 2016. I know my wife, Daniela, she was applying for a job, and she found the same company that she worked in Colorado the first time in 2011 when they opened up that company. And she's like, hey, there's a position open. And I was like, apply. And then she's like, nah, I'm going to wait till like May. I was like, why would you wait? Why don't you just apply? You never know. So she applied. And, she applied. She had a over the phone interview and so on and so forth. And then we moved to Colorado. We arrived in Colorado. This is the second time we moved to Colorado. I believe it was April 20th. 5 days later, I kid you not, 5 days later, she started her job. That weekend, well, we applied for apartments like before we moved. That weekend, we moved into our apartment. And then when you hear stuff such as, hey, God showed me that your house is upside down and things are not going the right way, that's definitely not from God. Because when we moved to Colorado, literally everything fell into place so perfectly. We were in Colorado for 6 years. Daniela went to school to further her education a little bit. And that was tough. That was tough too. We got back into debt. But by God's grace, like I mentioned earlier, we got out of debt twice. That's awesome. And, we've gone through some things. I've gone through a rough patch in my life being in Colorado, especially the last 2 years. It was extremely rough. I'm not going to go into details because it's not important. But God is so good. God is amazing. And like I said, I've gone through a really rough patch in my life those last 2 years that I was in Colorado. And I remember 2021, Daniela and I, we went to Mount Princeton. It's like this place in the mountain where they have water stuff. What do you call it? Hot springs. Yeah, where they have hot springs. And what we did, we went there, whatever, we enjoyed ourselves. And on our way back, we got into a car crash. And we flipped over. And that was a scary thing. It was super scary. It was the most interesting thing that ever happened. But by God's grace, God saved us from that. And none of us got hurt. Luckily, we were only going like 10 to 15 miles an hour. We could have been hurt. We could have been killed even, but we could have been paralyzed for life. Or only God knows. But by God's grace, we're still here. We're alive. And because of that accident, winter of 2022, it was around this time. I remember Daniela got home from work, and she tells me, she was kind of half crying, kind of like, we're gonna move. And I told her, man, no, why would we move? I had a really good job over there, and transportation's amazing. And she's like, well, I don't care. If you want to stay here, but I'm moving. I can't do this anymore. She was saying that she couldn't drive in the snow. Granted, we did have a better car with 4-wheel drive and all-season tires, but she was freaked out. And because I was going through a rough patch in my life, in a way, I kind of wanted to run away from my problems. But in a way, I was kind of like, okay, let's do something different. And she was saying, we're moving to Georgia. And I'm like, Georgia again? Oh, gosh, no. I'm like, no, I don't want to move to Georgia. But, I prayed about it and I was like, God, help me have peace in my heart if this is from you. I want both of us to be on the same page, both me and Daniela. And okay. Not much time flew by, and guess what? God gave me peace about the whole thing. And I remember Daniela was like saying, hey, let's move in November. And then she's like, well, we're going through these, different scenarios. Not scenarios, but anyways, we're just saying, hey, let's move in November. And then we're like, maybe September, I don't know. And then we're like, okay, let's just decide on May. And we moved. And being in a worship team at the church in Colorado, going through those rough patches and being where I was spiritually and mentally and all that stuff, I was kind of scared to tell the worship leader. I was like, man, I don't know. How am I going to approach her? How am I going to tell her? And I remember one time on a Wednesday night service, I was like, that's it. I got to do it. So I told her, look, we're moving to Georgia. And at first, in the back of my mind, I thought she's going to be like, oh, please don't, man. No, we need you, this and that. Nope. She's like, good for you. That's awesome. I'm happy for you guys. that was a huge relief on me. And and then the awesome thing is, again, how God works in such amazing ways that we sold our house and everything fell into play when we moved back here in Georgia. Everything fell into play, and it's just so awesome and amazing that God is like so faithful to us. Man, it's just like so awesome, that God is faithful. So again, same thing, I don't remember when it was. I think it was March, April. Daniela had applied for a job at one of the hospitals here in Georgia, in Braselton, and she got an interview, phone over the phone interview, and we did our things, we packed, so on and so forth, sold our house, and it was nice. We moved to Georgia. We arrived the 9th of May, 2022. 2 weeks later, 23rd of May, she starts working. And I saw with my own eyes, both Daniela and I, we saw how little by little everything fell into play so perfectly. Bought our house, even with the house how we bought it, it's just amazing because like one of my sisters, she's a real estate and she was working with us, and we're driving around seeing some homes and this and that, and we saw like 2-3 homes and we're like, not too bad, whatever. And then we came over here in this neighborhood where I live now, and I saw the house. Daniela and I, we saw this house that we live in now. And I remember entering in this house, I look at my wife and I was like, sweetie, this is our house. She's like, Cosmin, you're not gonna know. How do you know? I'm like, trust me. Just trust me on this. And she's like, oh, okay, whatever. And then, we put an offer on it, so on and so forth. And then some things kind of went down. Apparently somebody, quote unquote, was supposed to buy it with cash. Anyways, I don't want to go into the detail of it all, but yeah, they were supposed to buy it with cash, and then that did not go through, or whatever happens. And then the owners are like, hey, we want that. We're gonna take that offer that from that couple, which is us. And man, everything fell into play perfectly. We bought the house. End of June of 2022, moved in. Praise the Almighty God that we're here 3.5 years later, and I love it. And here's another thing. An amazing thing that happened. Me being a musician and have been a musician for a very long time in my life. I've loved music since childhood, and at some point I was like, man, I really want my own studio. But again, to build your own studio, to get all this stuff, it's expensive. By all means, it's not cheap. And of course, I bought microphones. I bought whatever I needed to do, to record. And of course, I've recorded in my apartment years ago. I've recorded in my, our little house in Colorado, in my living room of my home. And when we moved here, at our house here, and even our house in Georgia back in the day, 20 plus years ago, I recorded in one of the rooms. But when we moved here, I recorded in one of our rooms of our house, and I was like, okay, whatever. And we have this big shed. It's like a double story and 2-story shed. And I was looking at it and I was telling my wife, I'm like, man, we're going to build a studio out of this. She's like, yeah, right. Don't even think about it. She's like, I don't think so. She's like, do you realize how expensive that is? I'm like, I know, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen today. She's like, no, we're not. You're good where you're at. And she wasn't wrong. She was 100% right. And I really wanted a studio, but you know what? Sometimes it's good to wait. Cuz I don't know if I'm going to say that saying right, but there's like the saying where I heard that good things come to those who wait. And that's exactly what happened. And here I am in my studio, my own studio, by God's grace. I do have another video on YouTube where I was talking about how I was talking to a friend of mine, so on and so forth. But I'm not gonna go into that detail because, anyways, that video is already posted. I'm sure a lot of y'all saw it. But the idea is that I have my own studio. You know, I love to produce music. I love to sing and praise the Lord, man. The other night, I was up here just singing, worshiping God, and I had such a great moment with the Lord. It was such an awesome moment with the Lord, you know? And I know many times, especially for me, being a musician and, you know, I've led worship before and singing in church, sang solos many times in my life. It's extremely difficult. Till this day, it's extremely difficult to let it go. And I have a friend of mine a dear friend of mine that always tells me, Kusmin, gotta let it go, man. And it's just awesome, you know, to trust in the Lord. And that's my story. You know, I know I didn't go into full blown detail, but I just wanted y'all to know how amazing God is, you know, like how he works in our lives, and you know, how if you stay faithful to the Lord, great things happen. Sometimes we we wonder why things happen the way they do, or why does it take so long for certain things to happen, like in my case with my studio, right? I know when I used to live in California years ago, there were people that, I'm not gonna lie, they promised me, hey man, we're gonna build you a studio and this and that, right? None of that happened. And when you hear people telling you certain things like that, us as humans, we get hurt because we're like, man, you know, they told me this, they promised me this, and they didn't stick to their promises. But when God promises something, he sticks to it and it happens. And that's exactly what happened. By God's grace, the studio got built by a very good friend of mine. God put it in their heart to help me out. And by God's grace, I am in the studio and it's awesome. Yep. Well, thanks for watching. God bless you guys, and we'll see you in the next one.